Good evening and good afternoon for people in America. For those in Slovenia watching, I'll be speaking English today because my guest is an American gentleman, Jared Taylor. Many of you know him from my past podcasts, and those who are interested in politics know him as the godfather of white awareness, as I named him. Mr. Taylor, thanks for accepting my invitation. It's been a while since you've been a guest on my podcast. First question for you is: am I right to call you a godfather of white awareness? Because it might be that I'm too young, that my audience is too young, and maybe we also don't know the world, the global scene of white awareness so well. Do you know any other people that it would be right to call them godfathers of white awareness,
Well, first of all, thank you very much for
similarly
inviting.
as I've been calling you?
Thank you very much for inviting me back on your channel. I appreciate it very much. I realized I was scheduled to be on yesterday at a particular time, and I was detained because of what turned out to be a completely false medical emergency. I'm perfectly fine, but I was in the hospital when I was supposed to be talking to you. So I apologize to you and to your listeners who were expecting to see me. Again, I'm perfectly fine. It was a crazy, stupid false alarm. But there are many, many people who were involved in the United States in trying to raise racial consciousness long before me. You could perhaps, if you were being very flattering, call me the godfather of the modern white consciousness movement in the United States. But if you go back to Lothrop Stoddard, I don't know if your listeners have heard of him. He wrote several books. One was The Rising Tide of Color, and also Madison Grant. Madison Grant was a very famous man. He was involved in making sure that the United States passed the 1924 Immigration Act that explicitly restricted immigration of non-whites to the United States. He was a very important conservationist. He wanted to conserve not only wild areas in the United States and all sorts of animal species, but also the different subspecies of human beings. He thought white people, strangely enough, were a group that deserved to be preserved, just like every other subspecies of humans in the United States. Also, before my time, there was someone by the name of Wilmot Robertson. He was a very influential thinker in terms of white racial consciousness. Also, Revolut Oliver, Donald Swan. There are any number of people who were involved in this work. There was a man named Robert Patterson who founded the Citizens Councils of America. This was a group that tried very hard to prevent the forcible integration of schools in the United States. So there's a very long history of white people trying to wake up other white people to the kind of demographic and racial crisis that we face. But I'm very flattered when you call me the godfather of white racial awareness. But there are many people going back many generations who would probably deserve it more. I would say if anyone is really the key person in trying to maintain white racial consciousness in any kind of systematic and academic way, it would be Madison Grant. Just out of curiosity, have you ever heard of Madison Grant?
To be honest, no, I haven't heard of him.
Well, there you go. A very important man. His memory is being suppressed even in the United States. As I said, he was a very important conservationist, as well as writing books. He wrote several very influential books. One was called The Conquest of the Continent. The other was The Passing of the Great Race. He predicted that in the United States, whites could become a minority. So The Passing of the Great Race. These are both very influential books. But as I said, he was very involved and very influential in the environmentalist movement. There is a grove of giant redwood trees in California, and he worked very hard to make sure that they were preserved, and there was a monument to him there. That monument has since been pulled down. because he wanted to preserve not just species of animals and species of plants, but he also wanted to preserve human beings in their real, true variety, rather than being mixed up all through miscegenation and displaced through immigration. Also, he was one of the founders of the Bronx Zoo. The Bronx Zoo is one of the best known zoos in the United States. That was part of his attempt to preserve biological species. His name used to be very prominently associated with the Bronx Zoo, but now it has been struck from the lists too. And so many Americans have not heard of him. They've not heard of him because his legacy is being wiped out of the history books because of his white racial consciousness. And I would say that he was a more thoroughgoing preservationist. He was a more consistent and coherent preservationist than those today whose efforts are restricted only to animal and plant species. And many people who care about subspecies of crocodiles, for example, they are very concerned about the American crocodile and the Cuban crocodile. I can't tell them apart, but for marine biologists, it's very important to make sure they're separate and they have separate breeding populations, but they don't care at all about preserving white people. So I think Madison Grant not only was a great pioneer of the environmentalist and preservationist movement, he was a more consistent and coherent preservationist than those who are trying to blot his name completely out of the history of their movement. So again, I'm flattered, but really the term does not apply to me. As I say, if I would choose one person, it would be Madison Grant.
Was there ever the time in your life, because you were born and raised in Japan, if I'm right? So you were brought up, you grew up in Japan. Was there ever the period in your life where you were totally unaware of the fact that it really seems some people from the world, from the global elites, is trying to either genocide the whites or at least is being very different towards trends of whites dying out, basically?
Oh, the fact is, when I grew up in Japan, I was utterly unconscious of race. That may seem to be a very, very strange thing to say, because here I was, a little white boy, and my family were the only Caucasians living in this rural village on Shikoku Island. But my parents were very liberal. They taught me that race was not a significant matter, that any kind of racial preferences or racial distinction was a bad thing. And that was the way not only was I reared, but this was when I went to college in the 1960s. This was the way people thought. I only slowly came to an understanding of the significance of race and of the demographic and cultural challenges faced by white people. I would say it wasn't until I was perhaps 35 that I began to have some kind of comprehensive understanding of what the problems are. So no, the fact is, up until I was in my 30s, maybe late 30s, I really was unaware of what was going on in terms of race in the United States. I look back upon that period with a certain amount of shame, but I was naive. I simply swallowed the general ideas that were circulating at the time. It was perhaps more easy to swallow than it is today, because now with the internet, it's very easy to find people like you, for example, or like my own work, people who have a completely different view, who are trying to fight against the orthodoxy on race. At that time, it was more difficult, but not impossible. But I'm a little embarrassed that it took me so long to understand some of the obvious facts about race.
You said your parents were liberal, but I
Yes.
read somewhere that your parents were Christians, weren't they?
Yes, they were. But Christians can be extremely liberal. They were, yes. Go ahead.
This is a conundrum I've been dealing with lately, because I've always thought of myself being a Catholic. I identified as a Catholic, and I also identified as a Slovenian and a white person. But lately, I've been dealing with this conundrum of whether Christianity isn't even a greater or at least similar enemy to white consciousness than liberalism?
I would have to disagree there, because let us not forget, Europe became Christianized at different points in history. But I think it's safe to say that Europeans have been overwhelmingly Christian for about 1,000 years. And these suicidal ideas about race are relatively recent. I would say up until the 1950s. Certainly most Americans. And I believe if you'd even asked the question to Europeans, they would have said, well, of course, our nations are white. Of course, we take that for granted. They will always be white. The idea that somehow you could let non-whites, non-Europeans into our nations and say, oh, this is not only a good thing to do, it's our duty to do this. And our Christian faith requires this. No one would have thought that. Let us not forget that the people who colonized Africa, they were all Christians, but they believed that they had almost a Christian duty to govern those who were unable to govern themselves. The French empire builders, the Spanish empire builders, the British empire builders, the Portuguese, the Dutch, they were all Christian people. And they were, by today's standards, white supremacists. They believed white people had a special ability to rule and to govern, and that people of the third world would be better off being governed by white people. Those people were Christian. My belief is that Christianity, the church, has been corrupted just like every other institution in the United States. And don't forget, there are many Christians today who have a healthy attitude towards race. The other point I would like to raise is that in the United States, the Confederates, the people who fought for the independence of the southern states in the United States and fought to preserve slavery, those people were all deeply, deeply Christian. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, the people whose names are iconic as the great heroes of the Confederacy, they were very much serious, believing Christians. I would say more serious, more believing than practically any Christians living today in the United States. They really tried to build their lives according to biblical teaching. And in their view, biblical teaching certainly had nothing to say against slavery. There's no passage in the Bible that says you must free your slaves. It takes slavery for granted. So, no, I do not think that Christianity itself has been the cause of our racial downfall. Now, the Bible is a great fat book, as we know, and we can find passages in it that do tend to preach liberalism. In the New Testament, we do find passages of this kind. And there's that famous letter, I forget, is it to the Galatians, in which Paul says, in Christ, there is no Gentile, no Jew, no man, no woman, no slave, no free, but we are all one in Christ. Well, he's not saying those distinctions don't matter. He's saying, as far as believing in Christ and going to heaven, they don't matter. But here on earth, of course they matter. They matter tremendously. Paul was not saying that men can become women and women can become men. There's nothing in Christianity that suggests that. He's saying here are divisions, dividing lines between human beings, which are for us extremely important. But for God, they don't matter because he cares about our souls and nothing else. So I think that passage has been drastically distorted and manipulated into thinking that we should make no distinction between Gentile, Jew, slave, and free, man and women, which is obviously completely crazy.
I don't want you to trash your fellow intellectuals, like E. Michael Jones, for example. He's not the only example of Catholics. To be honest, I've got a couple of friends that are Catholics, that are Christians, that are not, in my opinion, as naive. But the majority of Catholics I know, even public intellectuals and so forth, they are keen to say something like that, I'd rather have a black Catholic than a white atheist, for example. This is also a E. Michael Jones's stance, to be honest, and he's the most prolific Catholic intellectual that is aware of the Jewish question, for example.
Yes.
And one of the greatest critiques of Jewish behavior is that they are subversive towards white race. And still, he is a great critic of Jews and Jewish behavior. He somehow helps their movement, sort of say, by saying that for first the race does not exist, and second, he doesn't care about race to the extent that he'd rather have a black Catholic than a white atheist. And to me, although I consider a Catholic too, this is my question about this is: would you say that this is something liberal in their thinking, or is there anything in for example, New Testament that you can take and interpret it like that? Would you say that E. Michael Jones has this liberal bug inside of his corpus of thinking, or?
Well, I've not really spent that much time or paid that much attention to what E. Michael Jones thinks about things. I had a televised debate with him in which I believe I was much more convincing in my defense of the existence of race and the importance of race. I believe anyone who has studied the phenomenon of race, its biology, its history, even the genetic basis of race, is convinced that race is a very important biological phenomenon. And we see the consequences of race wherever we look, wherever we find white people. We find generally certain kinds of behavior. Whenever we find Black people or East Asians or South Asians, we find different patterns of behavior. And these patterns were established long ago, and I believe they are based in the genetic substrate of those various groups of human beings. Now, I do understand that he has a particular loathing of Jews. On the other hand, if, as you say, he has no real value of race, I don't see Jews as working night and day to try to undermine Catholicism, for example. So just where his suspicion of Jews and his conception of Jews as an enemy, are they enemies of Christians? In any case, his perspective is one with which I disagree. Now, when it comes to what the Bible calls for, again, as I say, this is a very thick book. But at the time, I believe it's in Genesis, the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel has been the people, the humans, are trying to build this Tower of Babel in an attempt to reach heaven. And God says, well, no, this is an arrogant attempt to scale the heights of heaven. You don't belong up here. And so he causes them to speak different languages. He separates people. This kind of separation, as well as the separation of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. He's separating people. Never does the Bible, it seems to me, say that people can amalgamate. The children of Israel are to remain pure. They're not supposed to intermarry with the Hivites or the Jebusites or the Ammonites or the Amorites. In fact, they're under orders to kill all the Amalekites. They're exterminationists in the Bible. They are going to remain pure. And again, I see absolutely nothing in the Bible that says that white people have to give up their countries to somebody else, that we have to be bred out of existence through genetic swamping with people who are more numerous than we are. There's nothing in the Bible that says that. Now, you can interpret the Sermon on the Mount, for example. All of these generous things that white people or Christians are supposed to do. Well, does that generosity, does that mean that Christianity is some kind of suicide pact? No, I don't think so. And if white people, if Christians wish to be generous to people all around the world, they can send them foreign aid if they wish. They can send it out of their own pockets. I think that it is entirely wrong for a nation to tax its citizens so that whether they want to or not, their money goes to foreigners. I believe that's an immoral use of federal power or state power, certainly in the case of the United States. And I think most people living in Europe would probably feel the same way. Why does my money have to go to the Central African Republic or to Niger or Chad? Why has it got to go there? This all seems very mysterious. But there's nothing in the Bible, I believe, that requires this kind of capitulation, kind of suicide of the West. And in that sense, it is that I maintain that Christianity has been denatured and turned against itself, just as all the other institutions in the West, the media, the universities, the think tanks, businesses, all of this has been turned against whites. And I would say that the church is just one more casualty among many others, and is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a cause of this kind of psychological defeat.
I agree mostly with you, but if you're interested in my opinion,
yes, please.
My problem with the Bible has become, at least lately, that I started to think that Jesus was a Jew amongst Jews. And as a Jew amongst Jews, he says to his followers that they should forget about their mother and about their father to be able to follow him. This is the first problem I see with the Bible. Although he does say that he's not come to correct the Old Testament Jews had with the God. He obviously does correct it with it. He obviously comes to change the ethnic relationship with God, with the human relationship with God. This is what most of Christians and Catholics admit. They say, the Catholics say, we are the new Israel, we are the new Jews, in the sense that Jesus has come to change what was an ethnic religion in the Old Testament into a human religion, without fundamentally changing it. The only change he makes is basically changing it from ethnic to human. Wouldn't you say?
That is
we
certainly
couldn't put it like that.
I'm certainly no Christian theologian, and it's true that the idea is that Jesus has, in his own person, exempted his followers from following the Torah law. If fundamentalist Christians were to act in the way that the Old Testament tells Jews to act, then they would be just like Orthodox Jews. They would be keeping kosher. They would be following all of these very strange rules that regulate every aspect of human life. They don't do that because, in their view, Jesus Christ has said, no, we don't have to do those things anymore. Now, I think that is probably a correct interpretation of the New Testament. And all of Paul's letters are directed to non-Jews for the most part, I believe. Maybe some are Judaizers, but they are directed to people who are not. I mean, he himself was not a Jew, but he considered himself a Christian. So this is a religion that is a universal. And then there is the Great Commission, in which the order goes out to all the apostles, spread this gospel to everyone. And so, okay, that is certainly a different religion from traditional Judaism, which was restricted exclusively to a certain people. That does not mean that all the different peoples of the world are to intermix and intermarry and disappear. There's nothing in it that suggests that. And as I said, certainly for the first, 900 years of Christianity in the West, Europeans never took it in those terms. And I believe that if there had not been the kind of secular movements towards multiracialism, if there had not been other forces in academia pushing towards a different understanding of human interracial rapport, I don't think Christianity would have changed in that way. Perhaps I'm mistaken, but I believe that there were larger forces at work, and they also pushed Christianity into a kind of liberal Christianity. Let us not forget, there are many Christian churches today that fly the homosexual flag. And they think that to have any kind of discrimination against homosexuals is somehow non-biblical. Well, to the extent that the Bible says anything at all about homosexuals, they're to be stoned. No one, there's no passage in the Bible, I believe, that says that homosexuals should be priests or preachers. There's nothing good about homosexuality in the Bible. And yet today, many Christians, or people who call themselves Christians, have adopted this mentality from the secular society around them and seem to think that it's their duty as Christians to fly the homosexual flag in front of their churches. So again, I see Christianity as having been pushed and perverted in ways that are more important than any kind of Christian influence on the surrounding culture.
Would you agree with me? I agree that the anti-racism does not follow from Christianity or from the Bible. But do you know this movement of America First movement of being led by Nicolas Fuentes?
Yes, I'm familiar with Nicolas Fuentes.
They are becoming more and more popular, and I like Nick Fuentes a lot. But I have problems with his movement. That their motto is not because I hate Christianity. I consider myself a Catholic still, but I do have problem with his movement because their main motto, they are pro-white, sort of say, and their main motto is Christ is King. Yes. And while I agree with you that Christianity is not anti-racist, would you agree with me that it is at least indifferent towards racism in the sense that you cannot make it as your main epistemological ground for white consciousness movement? Would you agree with me?
Well, I don't know. There are racially aware Christians who can list all sorts of passages from the Bible that they say are the basis for white consciousness, segregation, whatever it is they wish to do. I had ancestors, Southern ancestors, who wrote defenses of slavery based on Bible passages. Now, if I were to try to persuade someone, if I were to give someone something to read to try to stimulate his consciousness as a white person, I would not give him the Bible. That would by no means be my first choice. But I don't think that there's anything in the Bible that is necessarily incompatible with a racial consciousness as a white man or a white woman. And to me, as someone who believes that race is the essential characteristic, I think that our consciousness is open to Christians, to non-Christians, to non-believers, to pagans, to heterosexuals, to homosexuals. If we are to have white nations, nations are not uniform. I know there are people who say, okay, when we have our white ethno-state, there are not going to be any homosexuals. There are not going to be any of this. They're all going to be Christian. Some of them take that view. Our ethno-state will be all Christian. I think that's a big mistake. What unites us is our race. We are biological brothers and sisters. And once we have established our family, then we will work out our differences, whatever they may be. A real nation of white people will have conservatives. It will have liberals. It will have people who want a welfare state. It will have people who want a kind of libertarian state. There will be people who will want to control guns. There are people who want to have armed citizens. There will be all of these differences. This is inevitable. But what unites us is our white race and our European heritage. And once we, I believe, are left alone to work out our differences, we can establish some kind of tolerant society in which different white people with different interests can pursue them. but we will be united in the sense that this is a nation for white people. I don't think that's out of the question at all. And that to me is almost the obvious thing to pursue. There's no reason to say that our white nation is going to exclude all of these other white people. Why would it want to do that? Nations don't operate that way. Any healthy nation, you could take the Japanese, you can take the Koreans, the Turks have a certain national consciousness. There are many different strands of thinking within those nations. And to say right from the outset, no, we're going to be this way, I think is unnecessarily exclusive, and it sets up conflict and it drives people away for whom there are other values besides race.
I wanted to ask you, did you see how Osmanoglu family looks like? Osmanoglu family, they are the descendants from the family that led the Ottoman Empire, and I'll show you the picture.
All right.
These children look like Aryans. It's a really
Aryans,
interesting thing
did you say?
to me. Yeah, like Aryans. Let me just find the picture.
All right. Well,
okay.
The original Indo-Europeans who spread all throughout the Western world, all the way into India, and spread Indo-European languages. They all descend from a group of people, and they were Europeans. And so the high caste Indians, for example, they tend to be much more light-skinned than the lower caste Indians. The Iranians consider themselves Aryans. None of this is particularly surprising. There are a number of theories as to why the Indo-Europeans were able to spread so rapidly. And one is that they were among the first to adapt a capacity to drink milk as adults. All human societies, infants can drink milk, but lactose tolerance, as it's called, usually ends by adolescence or late childhood. Whereas Europeans could drink milk, and therefore they could get much more nutrition out of cattle because they could both drink the milk and eat the meat. And so that's one of the reasons they were able to spread and conquer as far as they did. In any case, it is not surprising to me that there are people who claim to be Aryans. But now, what group is this? You're going to show me a photograph? I'm looking forward to seeing this photograph.
I found a photograph. It's just that internet's been really bad after I announced you're coming to my podcast.
Well, there are Turks. There are Turks, ethnic Turks, who look very white. Some of them. I suspect that I don't know. Alexander the Great and his armies. They were Europeans. They bred with local women. So no, there is a certain group of non-Europeans that do have a substantial admixture of white genes. I understand that there are green-eyed Afghans, for example, maybe even blue-eyed Afghans. Perhaps they too date back to Alexander's conquests. But to me, certainly, they are not, in my sense, real white people of the European kind, the way they find within the European continent and in the European diaspora around the world.
About the Turks, why we Slovenes are weird about the Turks is because we lived in Yugoslavia, and for example, Serbs and Dalmatians, Dalmatic Croats, and so forth, and Montenegrins, they are much more, at least dark-haired, if not dark-skinned, than we are on average. So it's really noticeable difference between an average Slovene, for example, and average Serb. And if you look at their genetics, Serbs have only 15% of R1A haplogroup, which was supposed to be a Slavic haplogroup, and Slovenes have 70% combined R1A and R1B, which are Slavic and Germanic, Indo-European haplogroups. So it's a really noticeable difference. And our teacher, our geography teacher, that is nowadays a director of Maribor Synagogue, taught us that every Slovene that has dark hair is a descendant of Turks. So we always thought that Serbs are a bit dark-haired because the Turks ruled over them for 500 years. And then you see such pictures of a Turkish family, and you're in awe.
Now, this photograph. Who are these people in this photograph?
Osmanoglu family. These are the descendants of the family that ruled the Turkish Empire for 500 years, and they don't are stereotypical Turks.
No,
at all.
But I've seen people who I understood to be Turks who looked like this group. Also, excuse me. You know that there were Christian slaves that were taken by the Muslims in large numbers, and some of them ended up being absorbed into the Ottoman population. This is not entirely without precedent. There are mixes, and I think it is almost always the case that if you look at any mixed population, the ones at the top tend to be more European than the ones at the bottom. There is a kind of hierarchy of color. You would certainly find that in Latin America, for example. In Latin America, you find every possible mix between Europeans and Amerindians. And the full-blooded Amerindians are pretty much at the bottom of the society. And the further up you go, the whiter and whiter and whiter the Mexicans become. You find this practically that same phenomenon throughout Latin America. And my guess is that in Turkey, although it's a population I'm much less familiar with, in Turkey, my suspicion is it's the same. Often in the higher ranks, you find lighter-skinned, more European-looking Turks. But what was the purpose of your showing me that photograph of Usman family?
I don't know.
I find it very interesting.
Because you mentioned Turks for a short sentence or something like that. Oh, yeah. I wanted to ask you: would you extend this hypothesis about the hierarchy of color? Would you extend this to Israel also?
Well, certainly, in the case of the Falasha Jews, these are Africans. I don't know if you remember, there was something called Operation Samson, in which this group of Africans, I believe they lived in East Africa. They claimed to be Jews. And there was some sort of airlift of several thousand of them into Israel. It turned out, genetically speaking, they weren't Jews at all. But they are very much the bottom of society. There aren't that many of them, and I think many Israelis consider it to have been a huge mistake to have let them in. And the people who really run Israel are the Ashkenazim. They are European Jews. And of course, they are Sephardic Jews. Some of them have come from all around the Middle East. Many from, I gather, from Iran or from North Africa. They have fled to Israel because things got unpleasant for them in the Muslim world. There is certainly, as I understand it, a color hierarchy in Israel as well. It's the most European, the Ashkenazi Jews, who tend to be smarter and more successful and end up running the country.
Would you say that many Ashkenazi Jews?
Yes. Would you not agree with
Ashkenazi Jews that rule Israel? Yeah. I didn't believe when I listened to left-wing anarchist Jewish media when they would talk about white supremacy in Israel, for example. I wouldn't believe them, but nowadays I do think there is something to it. Probably, I do believe that the wider Ashkenazi Jews, they do think about them as being superior towards more Semitic looking Arabs, for example. I do
Yes.
think this is true.
I think it is true. And of course, it seems pretty clear to me that one thing going on college campuses today, many Jews are complaining that they seem to be suddenly wrapped up in this anti-colonialist, anti-white movement. Of course, Jews have been very heavily involved in promoting anti-colonialist, anti-white movements, certainly on campus and in other institutions as well. I believe they've always had the view that because they can claim to be victims of the Holocaust, that they could never be oppressors. Jews cannot be an oppressor class because of Nazism, because of Hitler, because of the Holocaust. Whereas, of course, the people who are chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they don't think in terms of the Holocaust at all. They see Jews as a white group that is exploiting a non-white group. The Palestinians, certainly the people in Gaza, Hezbollah, all of those people, they consider to be third world colonized people. And in this sense, Jews, certainly Israeli Jews, are almost uber white people. So if you're going to oppose white people as by nature exploitative, as by nature racist, then the Jews fit very nicely into that scheme of things. American Jews tend to be wealthier than everyone else in the country. And you certainly cannot pretend that they are Black or Asian or anything else. They are considered white. And so if you've got a movement with a huge head of steam behind it that says that white people are not only just a suspicious bunch, but have traditionally been colonizers, exploiters, rapists, genocidal maniacs, all of these things, what you can then take that perspective and turn it on to what is happening in the Middle East today. What is it? 40,000 Gazans have so far been killed. You lose track after a while. I think it's very easy for these leftists to say, of course, not only they're white, they're the worst sort of white. They're obvious colonists. And this, I believe, comes as a great shock to many American Jews who think of themselves as perpetual victims, that they could never be accused of exploitation or of racism or white supremacy or any of those things. So this is a very, very confusing time to be an American Jew.
This is an interesting question also. I'm not really sure about it. It seems like a cope to me. It seems like a manipulation mechanism to me, but I'm not yet sure about it. What's your opinion on Khazar theory?
Okay,
Could it be that do you know the Khazar theory about
yes.
which goes as in that Ashkenazi Jews are not really Jews but are hidden Khazars,
No,
which are basically
that theory, as I understand it, has been completely demolished by genetic analysis. You will find that Ashkenazi Jews are certainly descended from a Middle Eastern Semitic group. They have considerable genetic overlap with Mizrahi Jews, with Sephardic Jews, but they also have a large admixture of European Jews. But I think that it's unquestionably the case that they are descendants in some manner or other from the original Hebrew population in ancient Israel.
Okay. A couple of questions from the beginning from the audience. Yeah. Just a second. Estimated amount of ethnic Slovenians in Slovenia is around 1.5 million remaining. Since political solutions are either illegal or prohibited, what kind of survival solution frame is there to adopt? And we can say this is analogical to the white race. The extinction of Slovenes in Slovenia is probably very similar to how the extinction of a white race from the globe is going on. So, do you have any idea of how to overcome the fact that all the political solutions are either illegal or prohibited?
Well, I wouldn't say all the legal solutions, all the solutions are illegal or prohibited. The obvious solutions, to me, there are two. One is absolutely no non-white immigration. And the second is improve birth rates. And this is precisely what certain European countries are doing. Viktor Orban is the best example of this. But the Poles, I understand the Slovaks, Robert Fico would be one who would absolutely support those ideas. Those are not illegal. It's not impossible. The trouble with white people all around the world, and I'm sure it's the same in Slovenia, is they're not having enough babies. I would bet, I don't know for sure, I would bet that the total fertility for a Slovenian woman is probably on the order of 1.6 or 1.8, something like that. I don't know. But it is well below replacement level fertility. It's the same for all white populations everywhere, except for a very small number of exceptions here and there. The Amish in the United States, for example, they have well above replacement fertility. And not so much as before, but the Mormons also have above replacement fertility. These are religious groups, though. They are doing this out of a sense of religious commitment. It's part of their group ethos, their group morality that's very much based in a kind of biblical, or in the case of the Mormons, semi-biblical theology. So again, if a European population is able to keep out immigrants and is able to sustain its population, then it will survive. Are there really only 1.5 Slovenians in the world, in Slovenia? Is the population really that small?
Maybe. Well, the official number is 2,100,000, but we haven't been able to count ourselves since 2002. And for example, Catholic Church has counted. The Catholic Church has counted the Catholics in Slovenia as 1,400,000, which basically means this is the number of Slovenes, because Slovenia has been traditionally a Catholic country. So this is my estimation. If Catholic Church says there are only 1,400,000 Catholics, then it's probably so many ethnic Slovenes in Slovenia.
Well,
the others
I have never been to Slovenia. I would love to go, but it's my understanding that there are very, very few non-whites in the entire country. It's very unusual to find Muslims or obvious Middle Eastern, or certainly Black people. That is the case, is it not?
Yeah, it's changing. Our streets are becoming darker. Up till now, our main problems were Turkicized, Islamicized Kosovo Albanians, for example.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
Although they have pale skin and dark hair, they look foreign to us and they behave foreign to us. And they are a totally different culture from individualized Slovenes. They behave as herds. They have collective consciousness. And Slovenes are, of course, as any other white population in the world right now, we are individuals.
Yes.
We are individual citizens we have no collective mind. We have no, and this has been the biggest problem up till now. But if I go to the city I live in right now, which is the second biggest city in Slovenia, there are more and more black and Arab people in the city center, downtown, for example. You can actually see how they are exchanging us.
Well,
and you can do nothing about it.
Are they coming into Slovenia legally, or are they illegal immigrants? Do they get visas? Do they get work permits? Do they get residency, official residency, or do they just show up, they sneak across the border? How would a black person come to Slovenia?
Some of them are illegal, but I do think that the most of them are either legal or legalized, or have been legalized. And legalization and legal immigration has been a thing of the so-called right wing. This is, for example, my problem with types like Orban and so forth. You can see that all of them, they are all civic nationalists. They don't care about race. If you press Orban, for example, he would be prepared to say that he doesn't care about the race. If a person comes into Hungary legally, he learns the language, and he respects their culture, whatever their culture is, besides individualized, liberalized Christianity, sort of say. This are all European countries that say that have Christian culture don't have any Christian culture. They have this liberalism, and they think it's Christianity or whatever.
Yes.
Our values are based on the negation of extremes in Islam. We see women with burqas, and then we get aware of our ancestors, as in our ancestors wouldn't put burqas on our grandmas or whatever.
No.
This is the only scope of consciousness.
Well, perhaps my understanding is different from yours, but I would think that Viktor Orban would go farther than that. He would say that Hungary is a European country. It is a Christian country, and he doesn't want any Muslims, for example. I believe he's used those very terms. We want no Muslims at all. And of course, in Europe these days, the great non-white threat generally is from Muslims. I think that he would probably in private certainly say that, of course, race is an essential aspect of it. Even I believe there was a Swedish minister just recently said, well, yes, we made a mistake. We thought that all immigrants were going to be the same. She didn't go so far as to use the word race, but she said, we have all of these people from completely different cultures, completely different societies, and they're causing all sorts of problems. And she said specifically, if we had had an equal number of Syrians and or Ukrainians, there would be problems, but not nearly to the extent that we have with these people. So I think that more and more, even though they may not be prepared to use the word race, there is a gradual awakening of the subject of race, even in Western Europe. Certainly, I think that Viktor Orban or Robert Fico, or there have been people in the Estonian People's Party, EKRE, they've been very explicit. I remember one of their ministers who was in a coalition government. He says, if you're black, go back. There is a kind of explicit racial consciousness that occasionally pops up, but it does not necessarily become an official part of a government's immigration policy. We want to keep Hungary white. I mean, Viktor Orban would say we want to keep Hungary Hungarian, but then how many Algerians or Tunisians or Somalis are going to learn Hungarian? They're not going to. And so it is an easy way to say we want to keep Hungary white by saying we want to keep it Hungarian. But I believe it's essentially the same thing. I mean, I hope it is.
Yeah, I would have been the happiest man alive if that would be true, if that would be some crypto white racism, but I am really skeptical. What I would also like to ask you, what do you think about many many people in America and also in Europe who are becoming critical of NATO, of EU, of Atlanticistic ideology? Uh, Many of them think that white people don't have bright future in Atlanticistic institutions or Atlanticistic um, ideology or
Oh,
countries, or
I
so to
would
say,
agree with
and
that.
they tend to. But my problem is they see the BRICS globalist alternative as an alternative, a better alternative for whites, and I mean, I do think that it's better to mix with Asians, for example, than with blacks. But if you listen to Putin and if you listen to Dugin, for example, Dugin was asked, "What if a black person learned Russian and came legally in the country and was respectful towards orthodoxy or something like that?" Right away, yes, I would consider him Russian,
Oh, did he
for
say that?
example. I don't
Wow.
have. Yeah, he actually said that right away. It was not like thinking a lot, and he
Hmm.
said it right away, and I was shocked. Although I was skeptical about Dugin and Putin all the way, but I
Well,
don't have hope in BRICS. You have a bigger hope in.
I must say, I've never understood Dugin. I've tried to read him, and I don't really understand what he's trying to say. Doesn't he have this idea about national Bolshevism? Isn't that one of his ideas? Uh, and also this kind of what does he call it? A Euro-Asiatic, some idea
Eurasia.
that,
Yeah,
what is it? In any case, I don't understand.
yeah, I do think that's a concept of.
In any case,
Well,
I've never
for me,
I've never taken Alexander Dugin seriously. I don't much care what he thinks. I realize that he is influential among a number of people. Now, what Putin is up against, on the one hand, he will say things that seem very nationalist, very pro-Russian almost in a biological sense. And yet, of course, he now seems to think that his great ally is China. Of course, Putin belongs in the West. Russia should be something that is allied with Europe, not with Asia. Germany is an obvious consumer of its gas and its natural resources. The West is. All of this has been put into an utterly and completely artificial situation because of, I believe, NATO's unwarranted and gradual aggression against Russia. There's been a real attempt to isolate Russia, to provoke Russia. Now, I am against the invasion of Ukraine. I was very surprised when Putin actually decided to invade in 2022. I thought that maybe if he was going to invade, he was going to invade just a few parts of the Donbass, but it appeared that he was trying to make a lightning strike on Kiev and put in a puppet government or something. I was very surprised by that. And this whole business of white people slaughtering each other, especially white nations that have terribly, terribly low birth rates. I don't know what the Slovenian position tends to be on the Russian-Ukrainian war. I know that many Eastern Europeans are completely against what Russians are doing, and I can understand that. But I believe Russia was very badly provoked by the United States and by NATO. But there must be some way to solve this problem. And I think that all of this practically unlimited support for Ukrainian defense and the idea that Ukraine can defeat Russia, I think all this does is prolong the slaughter and prolong the destruction. And then, of course, Western taxpayers will be on the hook to rebuild Ukraine in some form or another, whatever consequence there is of this. But I think that if it were not for these geopolitical circumstances, that Russia could be not only a friendly nation towards Europe, but also a kind of inspiration from a racial nationalist point of view. There is a conservative strain in Putinism, certainly with regards to religion, with regard to homosexuality, and I believe ultimately towards the idea of foreign immigration. All of these things are healthy aspects of the Putin regime. But what he has gotten that country into now is a horrible quagmire, and I don't see how we're going to get out of it.
Yeah, sadly. Can we take a couple of questions from the audience?
Certainly.
Jared, Friend for Freedom. Jared, can you visit Finland again, perhaps for the next Awakening conference? Meeting you would be an honor. I believe you are a model white advocate, intelligent, wise, principled, and well-mannered.
Well, that's a very kind thing. I would love to go to Finland. I was there once before for an Awakening conference, and I had a wonderful time. As the person who wrote that question may know, I was banned from the Schengen area for a period of 3 years. And once the 3 years elapsed, I had a plan to go back to Europe again, but then I was turned back at the border because, unbeknownst to me, the ban was extended for another 2 years. Now, it is my understanding, an official communication that I got with great difficulty from the Polish government, and it was the Poles who put the Schengen ban on me. I understand that the 2-year extension has not been extended. So I believe that I am free to return to Europe, and I hope to do so sometime in the spring of next year. I'd love to be invited back to the Awakening Conference. As I said, I had a wonderful time in Finland. And Tuka Kuru, who is the head of the Awakening Group, I consider a friend, and I hope he is doing very well.
Great. So Finns invite Jared to Finland. Is Mr. Jared familiar with literature of Lothar Stoddart? He claimed only Nordics are white.
Well, Lothar Stoddart, yes, he's the one who wrote the Rising Tide of Color. And the full title is The Rising Tide of Color Against White Supremacy. He was not as much of a Nordicist as Madison Grant. Madison Grant had this idea that there were Nordics, and then there were Mediterraneans, and there were Dinarics. And he had all of these different subcategories of white people. I think that's a big mistake. To say that only, I don't know, Anglo-Saxons are white people, or only people with blue eyes are white people. This is again very much a mistake. White people, I would define much more broadly in terms of European origins. But Lothar Stoddart, I do not believe. I've read 2 of his books. One is Into the Darkness, and another is The Rising Tide of Color. He may have been something of a Nordicist, but certainly not to the extent of Madison Grant. And again, I believe this is a very outmoded view of things. Perhaps there was a time when the United States in the 1920s, or maybe at the turn of the century, maybe in the end of the 19th century, the United States was sufficiently German, English, so that one could have said, well, we're going to remain Nordic, and we're going to keep out all of these Italians and Hungarians and other people. I think that day is long gone, and the Hungarians and the Italians and the Irish, once they've been in the United States for 3 generations, they tend to intermarry amongst all other European groups. They tend to go to college at the same rate. They tend to have basically the same household income as people who have been, people like my family who've been here for a long time. So I think we have a large European family, and we should not try to cut it up into little pieces and draw lines between Europeans. So in that respect, I disagree with Stoddart and Grant.
Mr. Taylor, how would you define a Slavic or a Slav person, and how would you define a Germanic person? What are the differences? If you
Well, gosh, this is by no means my area of expertise. Again, I don't think it's very useful to divide our great European family into little pieces, but I would assume that the easiest way to distinguish between Germanic and Slavic would be by language. Someone who speaks a Slavic language is probably a Slav. I would imagine that there are fine genetic differences between the two groups as well. Even something as accessible to the public as a genetic test that is conducted by the company 23andMe can tell you what percentage of your ancestry is from Southern Europe or from Eastern Europe. I don't know if they go quite in such detail as to determine how Slavic people are. But I know that Finns, for example, Finns who have been Finnish for generation after generation, I believe that 23andMe can confirm that they are 100% Finn and nothing else. So there are these differences, but I believe that the commonalities of our European heritage, European culture, and European civilization are more important than these small differences, even though some of them are clearly genetic as well as cultural and linguistic.
Fran for freedom from Finland says to Jared, I respect you a lot, sir. Keep fighting the good fight.
Well, thank you. I'm fighting what I think is the good fight. I've been fighting it for almost 35 years now, and I don't intend to stop. I think this is the most important thing that white people can do, is to fight for our heritage, fight for our ancestors, and fight for our descendants. I think that white people deserve to survive. I think we have contributed a beautiful, remarkable, wonderful culture to the world. I think it is subjectively, in my view, the best culture that human beings have ever produced. And I think objectively as well, we have made tremendous contributions to the world, and that only we can carry that culture forward in a meaningful way. And so to preserve our people, our culture, our heritage is really very much my calling.
Okay, the last question, more for fun than anything else. Given your personal history, what is something that mainstream commentators miss when talking about Japan's demographics, depth, and way forward?
Well, what most Western commentators miss is the instinctive hostility the Japanese have towards immigration. The usual prescription for solving Japan's demographic problems. It has a terrible birth rate. I think about 1.3 per woman, a terrible low birth rate. Maybe 1.6 was the last number. In any case, they say, well, okay, no problem at all. A lot of people want to come, just let in immigrants. And there are some people, even in Japan, who say, gosh, if we keep on this way, in 250 years, there'll be no more Japanese. The last Japanese person will die out. So we do need to keep our population going. At the same time, there's a very, very strong effort by the government and also by localities all throughout Japan to raise birth rates. If you go to the city websites of practically any big Japanese city, you'll find that there are dating sites that these are run by the city government, or there'll be sites specially for parents, how to get your children to marry and have children themselves. There is a real consciousness in Japan that they must have more children. But I think when outsiders look at Japan, at least those who are coming from an American perspective, they think that, well, the obvious solution is to let in all of the Afghans and Pakistanis that want to come. The Japanese have an instinctive understanding that that would be a terrible idea.
Okay, do you have yourself any questions? If you don't, I have to thank you once again for coming to my podcast. You've been a treasure, not only for my podcast but for our and awareness. So thank you for coming.
Well, it's always a pleasure to appear on your podcast, and I believe that a nation like Slovenia, it does have a hope. Maybe I'm more optimistic about your country than you are, but a nation that does not yet have a large number of non-white immigrants, and a nation that I believe has the potential to develop a sense of fellow feeling, of Slovenianness. Surely there are sparks of Slovenian pride that can be rekindled into some kind of flame. I mean, Slovenia would not exist as an independent nation were it not for this sense of not simply being part of this Southern Slav nation that it used to be part of. Surely there is a Slovenianness that Slovenes can be proud of, and that can hopefully lead you to some kind of regeneration of Slovene pride and Slovenian prosperity. I fervently wish this for your people.
Thank you. If I may say, we had luck in our bad luck, which was that we had to go through 60 years of some sort of communism.
Yes,
it was not bad as in Russia and in Warsaw Pact, but to be honest, paradoxically, it was bad for our economical health.
Yes.
Yet it was good in the sense that this bad health helps us now that we are not yet being a target of immigration of blacks and Arabs.
Well, we used to think that the nations behind what we used to call the Iron Curtain, we felt so sorry for them because they were economically under the control of the Soviet Union and not as wealthy as the West, but that protected you from the terrible poisons of the West. All of these crazy ideas about multiculturalism and race that the United States has been the source of. And when you talked about Atlanticism, I think the great problem with Atlanticism is that it includes the United States. We have been the source of these terrible suicidal ideas, and to have been protected from that was very, very valuable for Eastern Europe, even at economic cost.
With that thought, I say goodbye to you, goodbye to all the audience. Thank you. Thanks for all your comments, and thank you, Jared, once again for all your thoughts and coming here to my podcast.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mine also. Goodbye.
Okay, finished now? Finished now? Okay, well, I will check out.
I hope so. I'm not sure.